to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is from chapter 354. Chapter 354. The life of the nations is not contained in the lives of a few men, for the connection between those men and the nations has not been found. The theory that this connection is based on the transference of the collective will of a people to certain historical personages is a hypothesis unconfirmed by the experience of history. The theory of the transference of the collective will of the people to historical persons may perhaps explain much in the domain of jurisprudence and be essential for its purposes, but in its application to history, as soon as revolutions, conquests, or civil wars occur, that is, as soon as history begins, that theory explains nothing. The theory seems irrefutable just because the act of transference of the people's wills cannot be verified, for it never occurred. Whatever happens, and whoever may stand at the head of affairs, the theory can always say that such and such a person took the lead because the collective will was transferred to him. The replies this theory gives to historical questions are like the replies of a man who, watching the movements of a herd of cattle and paying no attention to the varying quality of the pasturage in different parts of the field, or to the driving of the herdsmen, should attribute the direction of the herd takes to what happens to be in the animals' heads. The herd goes in that direction because the animal in front leads it, and the collective will of all the other animals is vested in that leader. This is what historians of the first class say, those who assume the unconditional transference of the people's will. If the animals leading the herd change, this happens because the collective will of all the animals is transferred from one leader to another, according to whether the animal is or is not leading them in the direction selected by the whole herd. Such is the reply historians who assume that the collective will of the people is delegated to rulers under conditions which they regard as known. With this method of observation, it often happens that the observer, influenced by the direction he himself prefers, regards those as leaders who, owing to the people's change of direction, are no longer in front, but on one side or even in the rear. If the animals in front are continually changing and the direction of the whole herd is constantly altered, this is because in order to follow a given direction, the animals transfer their will to the animals that have attracted our attention, and to study the movements of the herd, we must watch the movements of all the prominent animals moving on all sides of the herd. So say the third class of historians, who regard all historical persons, from monarchs to journalists, as the expression of their age. The theory of the transference of the will of the people to historical persons is merely a paraphrase, a restatement of the question, in other words. What causes historical events? Power. What is power? Power is the collective will of the people transferred to one person. Under what condition is the will of the people delegated to one person? On condition that the person expresses the will of the whole people. That is, power is power. In other words, power is a word the meaning of which we do not understand. If the realm of human knowledge were confined to abstract reasoning, then having subjected to criticism the explanation of power that juridical science gives us, humanity would conclude that power is merely a word and has no real existence. But to understand phenomena, man has, besides abstract reasoning, experience by which he verifies his reflections. And experience tells us that power is not merely a word, but an actually existing phenomenon. Not to speak of the fact that no description of the collective activity of men can do without the conception of power, the existence of power is proved by both history and by observing contemporary events. Whenever an event occurs, a man appears or men appear by whose will the event seems to have taken place. Napoleon III issues a decree, and the French go to Mexico. The King of Prussia and Bismarck issue decrees, and an army enters Bohemia. Napoleon I issues a decree, and an army enters Russia. Alexander I gives a command, and the French submit to the Bourbons. Experience shows us that whatever event occurs, it is always related to the will of one or of several men who have decreed it. The historians, in accord with the old habit of acknowledging divine intervention in human affairs, want to see the cause of events in the expression of the will of someone endowed with power, but that supposition is not confirmed either by reason or by experience. On the one side, reflection shows that the expression of a man's will, his words, are only part of the general activity expressed in an event. As for instance in a war or a revolution, and so without assuming an incomprehensible supernatural force, a miracle, one cannot admit that words can be immediate cause of the movements of millions of men. On the other hand, even if we admitted that words could be the cause of events, history shows that the expression of the will of historical personages does not in most cases produce any effect. That is to say, their commands are often not executed, and sometimes the very opposite of what they want occurs. Without admitting divine intervention in the affairs of humanity, we cannot regard power as the cause of events. Power, from the standpoint of experience, is merely the relation that exists between the expression of someone's will and the execution of that will by others. To explain the conditions of that relationship, we must first establish a conception of the expression of will, referring it to man and not to the deity. If the deity issues a command, expresses his will, as ancient history tells us, the expression of that will is independent of time and is not caused by anything, for the divinity is not controlled by an event. But speaking of commands that are the expression of the will of men acting in time and in relation to one another, to explain the connection of commands with events, we must restore 1. The condition of all that takes place, the continuity of movement, and both time of the events and of the person who commands, and 2. The inevitability of the connection between the person commanding and those who execute his command. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 354. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 354. Strange blood in the continuous spinning thread of the web. William Shakespeare invented the bachelorette. He did it in Act 2, Scene 3 of All's Well That Ends Well, when the King of France offers Helen, a poor doctor's daughter, her choice of a husband in exchange for having cured the king of a debilitating sickness. The king presents a pool of France's top bachelors, and Helen rejects them all one by one, until settling upon her crush, Bertram. Bertram, however, protests the proposal. How can he, a noble, be expected to marry a lowly doctor's daughter? This confuses the king, worldly progressive that he is, so he proceeds to soliloquize on the essential oneness of humanity, educating Bertram about how strange it is that our bloods of color, weight, and heat, poured all together, would quite confound distinction, yet stands off in difference so mighty. Tolstoy comes to a similar conclusion about the oneness of humanity today. He starts things off by summarizing the inadequacies of the traditional conceptions about the transfer of the will of the people to historical figures in power. Having done so, he concedes that reason is only one tool of understanding. There is also experience. Experience shows that power is an actually existing phenomena. Power, he writes, from the standpoint of experience, is merely the relation that exists between the expression of someone's will and the execution of that will by others. Even this definition of power poses problems for Tolstoy. A conception of the expression of this will needs to be established for it to make any sense. The ancients placed this expression in the gods, but we moderns, little Nietzsche's, have killed the gods, so this responsibility falls to man alone. Tolstoy writes, if the deity issues a command, expresses his will, as ancient history tells us, the expression of that will is independent of time and is not caused by anything, for the divinity is not controlled by an event. But speaking of commands that are the expression of the will of men acting in time and in relation to one another, to explain the connection of commands with events, we must restore 1. The condition of all that takes place, the continuity of movement in time, both of the events and of the person who commands, and 2. the inevitability of the connection between the person commanding and those who execute his command. Continuity and connection between people. This cosmopolitan vision is useful not only for historians seeking an adequate definition of power, but also for individuals seeking a salutary meditation and remembrance of their place in the cosmos and their relationship to others. Forgetfulness of this connectivity is a sickness that breeds dissension and war. When we forget, let us recall, in Helen's words, that there is a remedy, approved, set down, to cure the desperate languishings. Daily meditation. Constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul, and observe how all things have reference to one perception, the perception of this one living being, and how all things act with one movement, and how all things are the cooperating causes of all things which exist. Observe, too, the continuous spinning of the thread and the contexture of the web. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 354 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the description, alongside my list of my Amazon wish list for books and movies. If you decide to support me by getting me a book or a movie, we will set up a Zoom call or something to discuss that book or that movie. Tomorrow, we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 355 of War and Peace. I hope you can join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.